On a cold Saturday morning, when the sky hung low over the city and a thin mist blurred the outlines of apartment blocks, Emily was not expecting visitors. Weekends were the only time she allowed herself to sleep past 8, but that morning the doorbell rang sharply at 9:17 a.m., slicing through the quiet like a knife.
She froze.
There was something unsettling about unexpected knocks, especially after a divorce. Emily wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself and walked slowly toward the door. Through the peephole she saw a familiar figure standing rigidly in the hallway, tall posture, expensive coat, carefully styled gray hair. Margaret Henderson, her former mother-in-law. Emily closed her eyes for a second, debating whether to pretend she wasn't home. But Margaret was not the type of woman who left quietly. The bell rang again. Emily opened the door halfway. "Well," Margaret said with a tight smile, "aren't you going to invite me in?" "I didn't know you were coming," Emily replied calmly. "I was nearby," Margaret lied. She lived 40 minutes away in the quiet suburb of Brookdale. She was never nearby. After a brief pause, Emily stepped aside.
Fine. Come in.
Margaret entered like an inspector arriving at a crime scene. Her sharp eyes scanned everything: the hallway rug, the polished wooden floor, the framed photos on the wall. She clearly expected chaos. When Daniel had left 4 months earlier, Margaret had told everyone that Emily would fall apart, that she was too sensitive, too impractical, too dependent. Yet the apartment looked different now. Fresh paint, new curtains, soft lighting, the faint scent of vanilla candles. Margaret's lips pressed together. "You redecorated," she observed. "Yes." "With what money?" Emily gave a small smile.
Mine.
Margaret removed her gloves slowly, as if buying time. "And how are you managing?" "I'm doing well." Margaret stepped into the living room and paused. The furniture was arranged differently. The old worn couch gone. In its place stood a modern gray sectional. The shelves were organized. A new coffee machine gleamed in the kitchen corner. This wasn't the space of a woman drowning in regret. Margaret hadn't expected that. She had expected tear stains, unpaid bills, silence. Instead, she found stability. "Daniel misses you," Margaret finally said. Emily leaned against the doorway. "Does he?" Margaret nodded. "He made a mistake." That wasn't entirely true. Daniel had packed his things in a single evening, declaring he needed more freedom. 2 days later, he was back at his mother's house. The plan had been simple. Emily would beg. Daniel would feel powerful. Then they would reconcile on his terms. But Emily had not begged. She had simply let him go. Margaret changed tactics. "He's been under a lot of stress," she continued. "Men sometimes make impulsive decisions." "Men?" Emily asked quietly. "Or Daniel?" Margaret ignored the question. "He's willing to come back." There it was. Not, "Would you consider taking him back?" Not, "Do you want to talk?" But he's willing. As if Emily had been waiting, Margaret walked toward the window, pretending to admire the city view. "You two could start fresh. Maybe move somewhere bigger. You always wanted a house, didn't you?" Emily folded her arms. "Why now?" Margaret hesitated just a fraction too long. Daniel had lost his job 3 weeks ago. He had tried freelancing. It hadn't worked. He had tried borrowing money. Friends had stopped answering his calls. Margaret was tired of supporting him. And Emily? Emily now had a promotion. Margaret had heard through a mutual acquaintance that Emily had become regional marketing director at a firm downtown. Good salary. Benefits. Stability. Useful. Margaret turned back with a soft expression that didn't reach her eyes. Because family matters. Emily studied her carefully. Family. Margaret had been the loudest voice during the divorce proceedings. She had encouraged Daniel to leave. She had said Emily wasn't ambitious enough. Not stylish enough. Not sophisticated enough. Now she was talking about family. "Daniel can come by tomorrow," Margaret said confidently. "We'll fix everything." Emily didn't answer. Margaret mistook silence for agreement. "Good," she said briskly. "I'll tell him to pack his things." She put her gloves back on and headed toward the door. As soon as she left, Emily exhaled slowly. She didn't call Daniel. Instead, she picked up her phone and dialed another number. "Hi," she said when the call connected. "I might need your help tomorrow." The next afternoon, Daniel stood in front of Emily's apartment building, adjusting his jacket. He had shaved, borrowed cologne from a friend, practiced apologies in the mirror. He wasn't entirely sorry, but he was practical. Emily was successful now, independent,
Organized. He could work something out.
maybe convince her to co-sign a lease somewhere nicer, maybe talk about shared investments. He pressed the doorbell. The door opened almost immediately.
But it wasn't Emily.
A tall man stood in the doorway.
Broad shoulders.
Calm expression. Rolled up sleeves revealing strong forearms dusted with paint stains. "Yes?" the man asked evenly. Daniel blinked. "I'm looking for Emily." "You found her apartment." Daniel forced a smile. "I'm her husband." "Ex-husband," the man corrected calmly. Daniel's jaw tightened. "And you are?" "Her business partner." That was technically true. Emily stepped into view behind him. She looked different. Confident. Relaxed. Not surprised. "Daniel," she said, polite but distant. He tried to step forward, but the man didn't move aside. "I came to talk," Daniel insisted. "We talked 4 months ago," Emily replied. Margaret had described this reunion differently. There was supposed to be gratitude in Emily's eyes. Instead, there was closure. Daniel glanced at the man again. "What is this?" "Renovation project," the man said calmly. "We're converting the spare room into a home office." Daniel's chest tightened.
We.
Emily met his gaze steadily. "I've moved on, Daniel." It wasn't entirely romantic. The man wasn't her boyfriend. Not yet. But he was someone new. Someone stable. Someone who didn't run back to his mother when things became uncomfortable. Daniel felt heat rising in his face. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. He turned abruptly and walked away, humiliated. Upstairs, Emily closed the door gently. The tall man, Aaron, raised an eyebrow. "Think that worked?" "Yes," Emily said softly. But she had underestimated one thing. Margaret Henderson was not a woman who surrendered easily. That evening, Margaret waited by her living room window for Daniel to return. When he walked in with clenched fists and burning eyes, she knew something had gone wrong. "Well," she demanded. Daniel dropped his keys on the table. "She's not alone." Margaret's expression hardened. "Oh," she said quietly. Her mind was already calculating the next move. Margaret Henderson did not sleep well that night. She lay in her perfectly arranged bedroom in Brookdale, staring at the ceiling, replaying Daniel's words over and over. "She's not alone." The phrase irritated her more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't jealousy, at least not in the usual sense. It was control slipping through her fingers. Emily was supposed to struggle. She was supposed to learn that leaving Daniel meant losing stability, comfort, security. Instead, she had renovated her apartment, earned a promotion, found new company. Margaret turned onto her side and reached for her phone. It was past midnight, but that didn't stop her from typing out a message. "We need to talk tomorrow. Don't make any rash decisions." She didn't send it to Daniel. She sent it to someone else. The next morning, the air felt sharper than usual. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, nursing a headache from the cheap whiskey he'd bought on the way home. Margaret moved around the kitchen briskly, the clink of porcelain louder than necessary. "You embarrassed yourself," she said finally, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. Daniel frowned. "I embarrassed myself? You're the one who told me she'd be waiting." "She would have been," Margaret replied coolly, "if you hadn't left the way you did." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "She had some guy there." "A co-worker," Margaret dismissed. "He didn't look like a co-worker." Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she sat down opposite him, folding her hands neatly on the table. "You need to think strategically," she said. "Storming over there and demanding entry makes you look desperate." "I wasn't desperate." "You were," she said flatly. Daniel's jaw tightened. But he didn't argue. Margaret leaned closer. Emily has always valued appearances. Stability. Respectability. If she thinks you've changed, truly changed, she might reconsider. Daniel laughed bitterly. Changed into what? Into someone employable. Silence settled between them. Margaret softened her tone slightly. There's an opening at my friend's real estate firm in downtown Willow Creek. Administrative work. Nothing glamorous, but it's a start. Daniel looked up. You already talked to her? Margaret's lips curved faintly. Of course. Across town, Emily stood in the lobby of a glass office tower on Maple Avenue. Willow Creek's business district was quieter than the larger cities nearby, but it was growing quickly. She liked that about it, ambition without chaos. Aaron stood beside her, reviewing renovation blueprints on his tablet. You handled that well yesterday, he said without looking up. I didn't handle anything, Emily replied. I just didn't react. That's handling it. She gave him a small smile. Aaron had entered her life unexpectedly 3 months ago when she'd hired his design firm to remodel the apartment. Unlike Daniel, he didn't make grand promises. He showed up when he said he would. He worked. He listened. Their relationship wasn't defined yet, but it was steady. Emily's phone vibrated in her hand. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Emily Carter speaking. Good morning, Emily. Margaret's voice flowed smoothly through the speaker. Emily stepped away from Aaron toward the window overlooking Maple Avenue. What is it, Margaret? I wanted to apologize for Daniel's behavior yesterday. That's unnecessary.
No, Margaret insisted gently.
He wasn't prepared.
Prepared.
As if it were a job interview, Emily thought. Margaret continued. He's starting work next week. Real estate firm. Downtown. That's good. And I thought perhaps we could all have dinner. Neutral ground. A restaurant. Just to talk. Emily stared at the traffic below. This wasn't about reconciliation. Margaret never moved without a purpose. What do you want? Emily asked quietly. Margaret's voice sharpened just slightly. I want my son to stand on his own feet. He should try that without leaning on me. A pause. Daniel always cared about you, Margaret said carefully. Emily almost laughed. He cared about convenience. You're being emotional. I'm being realistic. Margaret's patience thinned. You were good for him. Structured. Disciplined. And he wasn't good for me. The line went silent for a few seconds. Finally, Margaret sighed. Think about dinner. Thursday evening. The Riverside Grill. Without waiting for confirmation, she ended the call. Emily lowered the phone slowly. Aaron approached. Everything okay? She wants dinner. Are you going? Emily considered. Yes, she said finally. But not for the reasons she thinks. Thursday evening arrived with cold rain sweeping through Willow Creek. The Riverside Grill sat along the edge of the Cedar River, its windows glowing warmly against the dark water. Margaret arrived early, dressed impeccably in a navy coat and pearl earrings. Daniel followed 5 minutes later, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit him properly. You look tense, Margaret whispered. I don't like this. Then don't look like you don't like it. Emily entered precisely at 7. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with calm assurance. Aaron was not with her. Margaret noted that immediately. They exchanged polite greetings and sat. The waiter poured water. Menus were opened. Closed. Margaret began smoothly. Emily, you look wonderful. Thank you. Daniel's been reflecting. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I've made mistakes, he said, rehearsed. I wasn't focused. Emily met his eyes. You left. I needed space. You moved into your mother's house. Margaret interjected quickly. Temporary support. Emily folded her hands on the table. What is the goal of this dinner? Margaret smiled tightly. Closure. Or perhaps a new beginning. There won't be a new beginning, Emily said calmly. Daniel exhaled sharply. You didn't even give us a chance. Emily looked at him steadily. You ended it. Rain tapped against the windows. Margaret leaned forward. Emily, you're successful. Daniel is rebuilding. Together, you could accelerate that growth. There it is, Emily thought. Acceleration. Income. Shared assets. I'm not an investment opportunity, she said quietly. Daniel's expression hardened. So that guy is? Emily didn't flinch. Aaron is none of your concern. Margaret's eyes flickered. It's serious, then? It's respectful. Silence. Daniel pushed back slightly from the table. You've changed. Yes, Emily agreed. I have. The waiter returned with their meals, but no one touched the food. Margaret realized something unsettling. Emily wasn't angry. She was finished. And that was far more dangerous. Margaret shifted strategy one final time. Daniel signed a lease, she said casually. A small apartment on Oak Street. Starting over isn't easy. Emily understood immediately. They wanted help. Financial assistance disguised as reconciliation. I wish him luck, she replied evenly. Daniel stared at her, searching for hesitation. There was none. After a few more strained minutes, Emily stood. I hope you both find what you're looking for, she said politely. Then she walked out into the rain. Margaret watched her go, jaw tight. Outside, under the dim streetlights, Emily didn't feel triumphant. She felt clear. Inside the restaurant, Daniel muttered, It's over. Margaret didn't respond, but her mind was already moving again. She wasn't done yet. Margaret Henderson had built her entire life on one belief. If something slipped out of control, it could always be corrected with the right pressure applied in the right place. She had managed her husband's business affairs for decades before his death. She had guided Daniel through school, chosen his university major, even helped him decide which apartment he and Emily should rent after the wedding. Control was not just a habit, it was a reflex. But control had limits. And for the first time, Margaret was beginning to feel them. 2 weeks after the dinner at Riverside Grill, Daniel moved into his small apartment on Oak Street. The building was older, brick exterior, narrow staircases, thin walls. It was nothing like the spacious suburban house he had grown up in or the bright apartment he once shared with Emily. The place smelled faintly of old carpet and cleaning chemicals. Margaret stood in the doorway during move-in day, surveying the cramped living room with visible dissatisfaction. It's temporary, Daniel said defensively, dropping a box on the floor. It had better be, she replied. He had started the administrative job at the real estate firm downtown. The hours were long and the pay modest. For the first time in years, Daniel was forced to wake up early without someone reminding him. There was no mother calling him from the kitchen. No wife asking about his plans. Only the shrill sound of his alarm clock and the quiet hum of the small refrigerator. Margaret had expected this discomfort to drive him back into her orbit more tightly. Instead, something unexpected happened. Daniel began to change. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. Work required focus. Clients required patience. His supervisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen, tolerated no excuses. When Daniel tried to leave early one Friday afternoon, she simply looked at him and said, You can go when the work is done.
No softness. No emotional cushioning.
He stayed. Meanwhile, across Willow Creek, Emily's life was moving forward with a different rhythm. The renovation project in her apartment had expanded into something larger. Aaron had proposed converting part of the building's ground floor into shared office spaces for small startups. Emily had connections. Aaron had design expertise. Together, they drafted proposals, met with investors, and negotiated permits with the city council. They worked long evenings at the dining table that had once hosted tense arguments between her and Daniel. Now it was covered with sketches, financial spreadsheets, and coffee mugs. One evening, as they reviewed contracts, Aaron paused. Do you ever regret it? He asked quietly. Emily looked up. Regret what? The marriage. She thought for a moment.
No.
I regret who I was inside it. Aaron didn't press further. He understood enough. Margaret, however, was not willing to watch from the sidelines. She began appearing at Daniel's apartment without notice. Sometimes with groceries. Sometimes with unsolicited advice. Once with a folder of printed financial articles, she insisted he read. You need a 5-year plan, she told him one Sunday afternoon, standing in his small kitchen as if it offended her personally. This position is entry-level. You must aim higher. I just started, Daniel replied. That's precisely why you must plan. He felt irritation rising but kept his voice even. I am planning. With whose guidance? With mine. The words surprised both of them. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. I've always guided you well. Daniel hesitated. Maybe that's the problem. Silence filled the narrow kitchen. Margaret straightened. If this is about Emily. It's not about Emily, he interrupted. And for once, that was true. He had begun to see something uncomfortable. Every major decision in his life had been shaped by his mother's expectations. Even leaving Emily had been less about dissatisfaction and more about seeking refuge when conflict arose. He had never actually faced discomfort on his own. Margaret sensed the shift, and it unsettled her. You're not pushing me out, are you? She asked, attempting a lighter tone. I'm just trying to stand, he replied. She left shortly afterward, her posture stiff. That same week, Willow Creek buzzed with preparations for the annual Autumn Business Gala held at the renovated Riverfront Hall. Emily and Aaron had secured a small sponsorship table to present their new shared workspace concept. It was their first public introduction as business partners. The evening of the gala, Riverfront Hall shimmered with golden lights reflecting off the Cedar River. Entrepreneurs, city officials, and investors filled the space with polished conversations and clinking glasses. Emily wore a deep green dress that contrasted with the warm lighting. Aaron stood beside her, calm as always. Across the hall, Margaret Henderson entered on the arm of a longtime acquaintance from the real estate circle. She had heard about the event through her social network and had chosen to attend strategically. When she saw Emily standing confidently beside Aaron near a display board showcasing architectural renderings, her chest tightened. This was not the image of a woman who needed rescuing. Margaret approached with measured grace. Emily, she said smoothly. Emily turned, composed. Good evening, Margaret. Aaron extended a polite hand. Aaron Mitchell. Margaret shook it lightly, her expression unreadable. I've heard about you. I hope only good things, he replied calmly. Margaret glanced at the display. Impressive concept. Thank you, Emily said. There was no hostility in her voice.
No bitterness.
That absence unsettled Margaret more than anger ever had. You've built something substantial, Margaret observed. We're building, Emily corrected gently. A brief pause lingered between them. Margaret looked around the hall, noting the investors studying the presentation, the city official discussing zoning regulations with Aaron. You seem established, she said finally. Emily met her gaze. I worked for it. Margaret nodded slowly. For the first time, she felt something unfamiliar, not jealousy, not rivalry, but recognition. Emily had not been weak. She had simply been overshadowed. Margaret lowered her voice slightly. Daniel is doing better.
I'm glad.
He's working hard. That's good. Margaret searched Emily's face for any flicker of emotion, longing, regret, superiority. She found none. You won't take him back, Margaret said quietly, more statement than question.
No, Emily replied.
The finality in that single word settled heavily between them. Margaret inhaled slowly. Perhaps that's for the best. It was the closest she had come to surrender. Aaron was called away by an investor, leaving the two women momentarily alone. I thought you would fail, Margaret admitted suddenly, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. Emily blinked slightly, but remained steady.
Why?
Because I underestimated you. The honesty surprised them both. Margaret straightened again, regaining composure. I interfered too much. Emily considered her words carefully. Yes, you did. There was no accusation in her tone, only truth. Margaret gave a small nod. Then I suppose we both learned something. She stepped back, allowing a subtle distance to form that felt, oddly, respectful. Weeks turned into months. Daniel continued working.
He paid his own rent.
managed his own expenses. The novelty of independence turned into routine, and routine into quiet pride. He stopped expecting rescue. Margaret visited less frequently. When she did, she asked instead of instructed. Emily and Aaron's workspace project officially opened in early spring. The ground floor buzzed with young designers, programmers, and consultants renting desks. Sunlight filled the renovated space, reflecting off polished concrete floors. On opening day, Emily stood near the entrance, greeting guests. Aaron handed her a glass of champagne. "You built this," he said. "We built this," she corrected. Outside, Willow Creek moved forward as it always did, traffic humming, river flowing, seasons shifting. Later that evening, as the last guests left, Emily stepped outside for fresh air. Across the street, she noticed a familiar figure standing quietly near a lamppost. Daniel. He wasn't dressed formally, just a simple jacket and jeans. He didn't approach immediately. When their eyes met, he offered a small nod. Not pleading, not accusing, just acknowledging. Emily walked a few steps toward him. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. "Thank you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. "You look different," he added. "I am," she replied gently. He smiled faintly. "Me too." There was no tension between them now.
No unfinished arguments.
Just two people who had once tried and failed, and then chosen separate growth. "I won't bother you," Daniel said. "You're not bothering me." He hesitated. "Take care, Emily." "You too, Daniel." He turned and walked down Maple Avenue, disappearing into the city lights. Emily watched him go, feeling no regret, only clarity. Inside, Aaron called her name. She turned back toward the building filled with light and possibility. Some endings were painful, some were necessary, and sometimes the most frightening dreams were the ones that force people to wake up and finally live differently.